Obsessions and Phobias. Sigmund Freud. Obsessions and Phobias. Its psychic mechanism and its etiology. We will begin by denying two very frequently repeated assertions in relation to the symptoms object of this study, that is, to the obsessions and the phobias. It is necessary to affirm, first, that are not part of the neurasthenia proper, since the patients attacked by these symptoms are sometimes neurasthenic and sometimes not. Second, that it is not accurate to make them depend on mental degeneration, since we find them in people no more degenerate than most neurotics, and, moreover, they usually correct themselves, and even on some occasions, are cured. Obsessions and phobias are separate neuroses, with a special mechanism and an etiology that in a certain number of cases I have been able to discover, mechanism and etiology that I hope to rediscover in a large number of new cases. In order to better delimit our subject, we will leave aside a certain class of intense obsessions, which are nothing more than memories, unaltered images of important events. I will cite as an example the obsession of Pascal, who believed he saw an abyss open to his left since the day the carriage in which he was traveling was about to overturn and plunge into the Seine. These obsessions and these phobias, which we could describe as traumatic, are linked to the symptoms of hysteria. Once this group has been separated, it is necessary to distinguish two others, a. one's own obsessions, and b. phobias. Their essential difference is the following. In every obsession there are two elements, one degree. An idea that is imposed on the patient. Second, an associated emotional state. Now, in phobias, this emotional state is always anguish, while in one's own obsessions it can also be any other, such as doubt, remorse, or anger. First of all, I will try to explain the truly singular psychological mechanism of one's own obsessions, very different from that of phobias. In many true obsessions it is evident that the emotional state is the main one, since it persists unchanged, varying, on the other hand, the idea associated with him. Thus, the subject of our observation number 1 had very diverse regrets, of having stolen, of having mistreated her sisters, of having made counterfeit currency, etc. Similarly, people who doubt many things at once successively. The emotional state remains invariable in these cases, changing, instead, the idea. In others it is also fixed, as in the girl of our observation number 4, who professed an incomprehensible hatred of all the maids in the house, changing, however, person. Well then, a scrupulous psychological analysis of these cases shows that the emotional state as such is always justified. The girl number 1, who feels remorseful, has enough reasons for it. The women in observation number 3, who doubted her resistance against temptations, knew very well why, and girl number 4, who detested maids, had perfect reason to complain about them. The pathological hallmark of these cases consists, then, only in the following two singular characters, 1 degree. That the emotional state has been eternalized. Second, that the associated idea is no longer the correct idea, the original idea, related to the etiology of the obsession, but a substitute idea for it. Proof of this is that in the patient's history, and in the initial period of the obsession, the original idea can always be found, later replaced. Such substituted ideas have common characteristics, corresponding to truly painful impressions of the individual's sexual life, which he has forced himself to forget, without achieving more than replace the irreconcilable idea with another, inappropriate to be associated with the emotional state, which, for its part, has remained unchanged. It is to this forced connection of the emotional state and the associated idea that the absurd character of obsessions is due. I will expose here my observations and then I will give as a conclusion an attempt at a theoretical explanation. Observation number 1. A girl, who reproached herself for having stolen, made counterfeit currency, etc., according to her daily readings, realizing, however, the absurdity of such reproaches. Rectification of substitution. He reproached himself for onanism, which he practiced in secret, without being able to renounce it. She was cured by scrupulous observation, which prevented her from masturbating. Observation number 2. A young medical student, who suffered from a similar obsession. He reproached himself for multiple immoral acts, having killed his cousin, deflowered his sister, burned down a house, etc. He came to feel the need to continually turn around in the street to convince himself that he had not killed the passerby he had just passed. Rectification. He had read in a popular medical book that onanism, to which he indulged, demoralized the individual, and he was very impressed by the news. Observation number 3. Several women who complained about the obsession of throwing themselves out of the window, hurting their children with knives, scissors, etc. Rectification. Typical obsessive temptations. It was about women dissatisfied in their marriage, who struggled against the desires and voluptuous ideas that arose in them in view of other men. Observation number 4. A perfectly healthy spirit and very intelligent young woman, who showed an infinite hatred against the maids of the house. Home. This hatred had been awakened in her by the impudence of a maid and had been passed on from maid to maid, making housekeeping impossible. As a reason for this feeling, mixture of hate and disgust claimed the subject that the filth of those creatures spoiled her idea of love. Rectification. The young woman had been an involuntary witness of a love scene of her mother. Upon surprising her, she covered her face and covered her ears, then doing everything possible to forget the scene, which disgusted her, and the memory of which would have forced her to separate from her mother, whom she loved tenderly. He achieved, in effect, the desired oblivion, but the anger aroused in her by seeing her idea of love soiled persisted in her spirit, and soon after she associated herself with the idea of a person who could replace her mother. Observation number 5. A young woman had isolated herself almost completely as a result of an obsessive fear of urinary incontinence. Could not leave your room or receive a visitor without having urinated multiple times. Being at home and at rest, he felt no fear. Rectification. It was a temptation or an obsessive mistrust. What he distrusted was not his bladder, but his resistance against a loving impulse. This was demonstrated by the origin of the obsession. Once, in the theater, at the sight of a man she liked, she had felt a amorous desire, accompanied, as always in the spontaneous pollution of women, by the desire to urinate. Having been forced to leave the theater, she was seized from that moment with the fear of feeling the same feeling, but the desire to urinate was replaced by the love desire. It healed completely. The preceding observations, although they show various degrees of complexity, have in common that the original, irreconcilable, idea has been replaced by another. In the ones that we will now discuss, the original idea has also been replaced, but no longer by another idea, but by acts or impulses that originally served as relief or protective procedures, and which now find themselves in a grotesque association with an emotional state, with which they do not harmonize, but which is the original, and continues to be just as justified as in the beginning. Observation number 6. Obsessive arithmomania. A woman had contracted the obsession of counting the flagstones of the sidewalk, the steps, etc., and he performed continuously, in the grip of a ridiculous state of anguish. Rectification. He had started counting to distract himself from his obsessive ideas, temptations, and he had succeeded, but the primitive obsession was replaced by the impulse to count. Observation number 7. Obsessive speculation, Grübelsucht. A woman suffered from attacks of this obsession, which did not stop except during her periods, being then replaced by hypochondriac fears. The subject of the attack was a part of the body or a function, for example, breathing. Why is it necessary to breathe? And if I didn't want breathe, etc. Rectification. At first she had been afraid of going crazy, Hypochondriac phobia, very common in women not satisfied by their husbands, which was his case. To convince herself that she wasn't going to go mad and that she still had her intelligence, she had begun to ask herself questions and deal with important problems. With this he was able to calm down soon, but mental speculation came to replace the phobia. For 15 years he had alternately suffered periods of fear, pathophobia, and obsessive speculation. Observation number 8. Obsessive doubt. Several cases that showed the typical symptoms of this obsession, but that were simply explained. These people had suffered or were still suffering from various obsessions, and the awareness that the obsession had disturbed their actions and interrupted the course of their thoughts, made them legitimately doubt the fidelity of his memory. Everyone feels his confidence in his own acts shake, and is forced to reread a letter or redo an account when his attention has been repeatedly diverted several times during the performance of the act. Doubt is a logical consequence of the presence of obsessions. Observation number 9. Obsessive doubt, hesitation. The subject of observation number 4 had become excessively slow in all the acts of ordinary life, particularly those of her headdress. It took him whole hours to tie his shoelaces or to fix his nails. For her part, she explained it by saying that she could not attend to her headdress while she was preoccupied with obsessive ideas or immediately after each return of them. Observation number 10. Obsessive doubt. Fear of written papers. A young woman, who had felt scruples after having written a letter. And that from then on he collected all the papers he saw, giving as an explanation the fear of having confessed a secret love. By dint of incessantly repeating the name of her beloved, the fear had arisen in her that said name had escaped from her pen, having traced it on any piece of paper in a moment of self-absorption. Observation number 11. Mysophobia. A woman, who washed her hands 100 times a day, and for not touching them with them she opened the latches of the doors pushing them with the elbow. Rectification. It was the case of Lady Macbeth. The ablutions had a symbolic character and were intended to substitute physical purity for moral purity, which the subject regretted having lost. She was tormented by the remorse of a marital infidelity, the memory of which she had decided to drown. Regarding the theory of the substitution, I will limit myself to answering 3 questions that are raised here. First, how can such substitution be accomplished? It seems to constitute the expression of a special psychic disposition. At least, we very frequently find in obsessions the similar heredity, as in hysteria. Thus, the patient in observation number 2. He told me that his father had suffered similar symptoms, and one day he introduced me to a first cousin with obsessions and a convulsive tic, and his sister's daughter, an 11-year-old girl, already showing obsessions, probably remorse. Second, what is the reason for such substitution? In my opinion, we can consider it as an act of defense of the self against the irreconcilable idea. Among my patients there are some who remember the effort of will made to expel the idea or memory. Painful field of consciousness, observations numbers 3, 4, and 11. In other cases, this expulsion of the irreconcilable idea occurred in a unconscious way, which has not left any trace in the memory of the sick. Third, why has the emotional state associated with the obsessive idea been perpetuated, instead of vanishing like the other states of our ego? The answer to this question is found in the theory of hysterical symptoms, the result of my collaboration with Brewer. Here I will only point out that the very fact of substitution makes the disappearance of the emotional state impossible. To these groups of own obsessions is added that of phobias. These differ from obsessions as we have previously indicated in that the emotional state concomitant to them is always anguish. We will now add that the obsessions are multiple and more specialized, and, on the other hand, the phobias, rather monotonous and typical. Also in phobias we can distinguish 2 groups, characterized by the object of anguish. First, common phobias, exaggerated fear of those things that everyone fears something, such as the night, loneliness, death, diseases, snakes, the dangers in general, etc., and second, occasional phobias, anxiety arising in special circumstances that do not inspire fear in the healthy man. Thus, agoraphobia and other phobias of locomotion. It is interesting to note that these last phobias are not obsessive, like their own obsessions and common phobias. The emotional state does not arise in these cases, but in special circumstances, which the patient carefully avoids. The mechanism of phobias is totally different from that of obsessions. It is no longer a question of a substitution, nor is it possible to discover, by means of psychic analysis, an irreconcilable replaced idea. There is only an emotional state of anguish, which by a kind of choice has highlighted all the ideas likely to become the object of a phobia. In cases of agoraphobia, etc., the memory of an anxiety attack is frequently found, and in reality what the patient fears is the emergence of such an attack in those special circumstances in which he believes he will not be able to escape. The anguish of this emotional state existing at the bottom of the phobias is not derived from any memory. We will therefore have to ask ourselves what could be the origin of this powerful condition of the nervous system? In answer to this question, I hope to be able to prove once again that it is justified to establish a special neurosis, the anxiety neurosis, of which this emotional state is the main symptom. We will list its various symptoms and insist on the need to distinguish this neurosis from neurasthenia, with which it is now confused. Thus, phobias are part of the anxiety neurosis and are almost always accompanied by other symptoms of the same series. Anxiety neurosis is also of sexual origin, but it is not linked to ideas borrowed from sexual life, nor does it really have a psychic mechanism. Its specific etiology is the accumulation of reproductive tension, caused by withdrawal or reproductive irritation. Frustrated, due to the effect of reserved intercourse, the relative impotence of the husband, the excitations without ulterior satisfaction of the boyfriends, forced abstinence, etc. In these conditions, extraordinarily frequent, especially for women, in today's society, it is in which anxiety neurosis develops, of which phobias are a psychic manifestation. To conclude, we will indicate that phobias and obsessions themselves can and do combine, indeed, with great frequency. Thus, we can find that at the beginning of the disease there was a phobia, developed as a symptom of anxiety neurosis. The idea that constitutes the phobia and to which the fear is associated can be replaced by another idea, or rather by the protective procedure that seems to alleviate the fear. Observation number 6, obsessive speculation, is a perfect example of this class, that is, of a phobia doubled as an obsession proper, by substitution. End. Obsessions and phobias. Sigmund Freud.